Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Adobe Live. My name is Flynn, and I'm here with Jeremy Lord. Hello, Jeremy.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Flynn. How's everybody
Um,
going?
how is everybody going? I think there's quite a few people that are still here from Alice Lee's amazing illustration session before. She's amazing, isn't she? So we've got some more illustration for you today. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sticking around. And if you're just joining in, welcome. Chris Allen from Scotland. That's super cool. We love to find out where you're from. We especially, we're here in Sydney, Australia. Jeremy's also in Sydney, different parts of Sydney at the moment. Someone else in chat was from Sydney. Matt West from Long Island. That's super cool.
Sick.
Keith, D, Steve, Elizabeth, Johanna's in the house. Sam Peterson, you're still here. That's great. Thank you for hanging out with us. So we're here for 2 hours, and this is our second in a series of illustration with Jeremy Lord. So I hope you caught the first one. If you didn't, it is up on YouTube at the moment. And if you're watching this on replay, we'll share a link down the bottom so you can go back and check that out. But just before we get kicked off, forgot to share the schedule yesterday, so naughty me. I'm just going to quickly bring up this schedule, what we're doing here on Adobe Live in Down Under. So Tuesday we had Getting Started with Premiere Pro with Ian Haig. That is also a series, so we've got some more of that coming. Wednesday at 8:30, that's us today. We're here with Jeremy Lord. Tomorrow we have Martina Martian coming in, doing her first Adobe Live in this working from home style. So very excited about that. That's tomorrow morning. And then on Friday, we have Joy Lee doing the same. So Joy Lee has joined us on Adobe Live before, but not in this remote sense. So she's going to be kicking off some branding and design. And then we have the wonderful Bill Hope joining us for Impossible Isometric Illustration. So I hope you guys can join us for some of those. A lot happening.
That's got some like Neil deGrasse Tyson titles behind it.
Do you like
Bill
the
Hope's
Impossible
one.
Isometric Illustration?
Yeah,
I was
that's
particularly
great.
proud. But yeah, so there's lots of interesting stuff happening this week, and thank you so much. So I think we'll pretty much just get stuck into it today.
Yep.
Jeremy, do you want to kind of? We'll switch over to your screen, and you can just take it away. We've got so much to cover.
Yeah. So today we'll take a look at a bunch of different things that have to do with kind of Photoshop basics in a slightly more kind of stylized approach. So spoiler alert, I guess we will be kind of looking at sort of creating something a little bit like this. And then if we've got time, I'd love to add in maybe an element of type in here as well. That's if we've got time. So we'll be looking at color modes. We'll be looking at these ideas of destructive versus non-destructive workflow, and various selection tools, which is the thing that we'll kick off with, because there's a bunch of selection tools in Photoshop, and it can be a little bit confusing as to which one to use when. But before we do that, I just thought I'd recap what we did last week. And again, as Flynn mentioned, that replay is live now, so you can catch all of that. We basically had a look at sort of taking a sketch, fixing it up a little bit, sort of tweaking the brightness, lightness, and then how to use all the different kind of blending modes to paint over it in a very, very basic way. And so we looked at things like creating brushes. We looked at basic sort of tool settings with the brushes and downloading brushes from Carl T. Webster and other places. So that was the kind of overall gist of last week's session, just working with an analog sketch and then coloring it up to get a final digital product.
Super cool.
Yeah, it was super. We got heaps of questions, which is always something that I really love when I'm doing this, because I tend to kind of go into a bit of a groove. So yeah, please, as we're going, like, ask any questions, even if they're related to what we're doing or if they're not related to what we're doing. Ask away. I always really enjoy all the questions that you guys have. So so don't hesitate.
Yeah, awesome. And just on that as well, for those familiar with the stream, you'll know this, but for anyone that might be new, we do have a little Q&A timer just above our heads, and that's just a little bit of a break in the middle to answer any of the bigger questions that we don't get to. So if you ask a question that we haven't got to, we might be saving it up for that section. But please feel free to ask questions as you go. And if you're watching this on YouTube or anywhere else, come over to behance.net/live, join the chat, tell us where you're from, and ask any questions that you have for Jeremy, and we'll get to it.
Yeah. All right. So this is just a sketch. We'll come back to this in a little while. But I guess the first thing that I want to kind of get to is get stuck in straight away and look at the different selection tools. So we're going to leave Lee Van Cleef for a sec, and we are going to open this guy up. Whoops. What's happened? I've just crashed everything. That is no good at all. No. Man, I knew this would happen. Quick thinking. There we go. All right. Sorry about that.
We're just proving
early in the morning here.
Proving that we're live. Yeah, the internet's got to get warmed
exactly.
up. The glass that carry our data packets outside of the country just are a little bit sleepy today.
As am I. All right, so again, like we're looking at this kind of stuff. Last week we kind of covered this idea that Photoshop is based on pixels, and this is like the most kind of basic aspect of Photoshop, is that whatever you're doing to each individual one of these pixels. And so the kind of fundamental thing with Photoshop, if you want to be able to kind of speak Photoshop language, is essentially a big part of that is how well do you tell Photoshop which of these pixels you want to do stuff to, and then you can do it to those pixels. So do you want to, in a lot of cases, Photoshop exists to kind of, let's like take this leaf and pick it off the background so we can put it on another background. That's a big part of kind of the basic idea behind Photoshop, even though obviously that's not all it does. But there's a range of different selection tools that you can use to do that. And that's why there's so many different selection tools in Photoshop. So if you look in your menu here, you've got 4 different selection tools of various shapes. So the rectangular marquee tool will just make rectangular shapes. Not super helpful in what we're trying to do here because this is all very organic, but this can be really awesome for like erasing big swathes of your image or anything like that. So we got that. We've got an elliptical tool, so that can create ellipses or perfect circles if you hold down Shift. And then we've got a single pixel. This is more for your kind of web design kind of thing. So that's 4 selection tools. Then in here, we've got the lasso tools, which is what we'll be looking at mostly today. So they all allow you to draw a selection. So that's going to get, by the way, and again, this is like super duper basics, but these little kind of dashed lines, that indicates a selection. The vernacular is, they're called the marching ants because they look like little ants kind of marching through, and that indicates an active selection. And if I zoom in real close on this, you can literally see that it is selected down to a T, certain pixels and not others. Depending on where I draw my line, it will select a bunch of pixels or not. There we go. All right. So obviously it's not, when you zoom in like this, it doesn't appear as smooth as what I actually drew, because obviously we're using squares when we're using Photoshop. So trying to tell Photoshop, like, I want these ones, but not the ones right next to it, is basically the entire name of the game here. And so different selection tools will allow you to do different things, and we'll get stuck into those. And then there's these 3, which are, again, more selection tools. We'll take a look at the bottom 2 today. But yeah, essentially it has like 10 different selection tools because the name of the game is speak my language and use selections and let me know which pixels you want to do the thing you're about to do. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. So yeah, so the most basic one in here is, sorry, actually, I forgot. There's another selection tool down here, which we'll look at in a sec, but that's an extra special bonus one. So the main one that we can look at here is this drawing selection tool. So let's say that we want to pick this leaf off of the image without the shadow, without everything else. So I purposely picked this image because there's going to be a few different challenges here. If you're familiar with how green screens work, because we've got a green plant and it's sitting on a green screen, if it was just a matter of us like selecting this image from this color here, this kind of peach color, that could potentially be super easy to do. But we're going to have to like kind of use a few different things here. So first thing is always, I guess, try the quick way and go to the magic wand tool. So the magic wand tool basically allows you to click, and what it does is it automatically selects all the pixels that are relatively similar to the ones that you're seeing, that you've clicked on. So for instance, if I click on, and again, like we need to zoom in here. If I click on this pixel, that's this kind of slightly in between kind of gray green color, it's going to select in the vicinity of that all the pixels that are relatively similar to it. So it's not getting those on the left and it's not getting those on the right, because it has that setting that says on either side, left or right, this is how far away from this original pixel you go. And you can set that. So up here in your toolbar on the magic wand, you've got this thing called tolerance. This basically says how much the lasso tool will tolerate different pixels. So it's basically kind of how open-minded it is about what constitutes a color that's similar to the one we've got here. So if I click on that with a higher tolerance, it's selected a much larger area. If I drop that tolerance down to 5, and I believe the minimum is 5, I think you can go to 1. If I click on that same pixel, or one that's similar, it's only going to select a few of those because it's far less tolerant of what it's considering to be similar to this, if that makes sense. So I usually leave that on about sort of 20, depending on what I'm kind of trying to do. And then I can go in and make these kind of large selections. So you'll notice in here that it hasn't gone all the way down to the bottom. It hasn't selected these guys, mostly because those guys are too different down there. And it's obviously stopped on the green. But again, one of the issues here is that if we zoom in on here, you can see that it has actually included, so in the bottom left here is where my selection exists. And you can see that if I go where the selection is not active, I get my crosshairs. If I go back into it, I get the move selection tool. So I can take that selection and move it around. I don't want to do that right now, but that's my active, that's inactive. So there are a few green pixels in there. And there's also a few kind of lighter pixels in the green. So because of the nature of pixels and how it works, this has nothing to do with kind of Photoshop not doing its job properly or anything like that. This is just the nature of working with pixels. There's always going to be a little bit of compromise with something like this, which is why you will always hear people go, send me high-res images. The higher the resolution on the image, the clearer this line will become. The lower the resolution, the worse it will become, and the more of the things that you don't want to select will be selected. And potentially, even worse, is things that you do want to be selected won't be. So for instance, in this case, if I wanted to get this little bit here on my leaf, that's currently not selected. So these pixels are being selected even though they're technically part of the leaf. So I might have to come in and edit that a little bit later on. But essentially, that's my magic wand tool. So you can see that it selected all of this. But what about the bottom here? So there's two ways that I can go about this. I can either hold down Shift, and you'll see that little plus sign appear on my icon as I hold down Shift, and click down here as well. So that's going to select this one and then that one. And I can just keep clicking all around until I've got a relatively good selection. So you can see that it's kind of doing little kind of funny things with banding, and it's not selecting certain pixels because, again, it's having a little bit of an issue detecting where the colors are that you want. So we can do it this way, which is, might be a little bit time consuming. You might click on the wrong part of the image. There's a range of different kind of human errors that can come into here. But it will essentially give us something that might look relatively nice. So if we turn this off, you can see that that is now my selection. Let me just pop that on a black layer so that you can see what's happening. There. So you can see that we've got, that is all that we've selected in here. And that's not too bad, but it's not necessarily what we're trying to go for. So let me delete that. A faster way to do the same thing with maybe a little bit less control is to click and then right click and say similar. So this is going to select everything that is similar to those colors everywhere in the image. And potentially, depending on what you've set your tolerance to, it will select some of the leaf as well. So some of these reflections in the leaf may get selected too. So if we boost that to 50, let's give it a shot. Yeah, see, it's picking up some of the little reflections because it's reading those as close enough to this particular pixel that I selected, that I clicked on. So there's always a little bit of give and take with this, but depending on the image that you've got, one of these things will work out for you. The idea, however, is that you should probably use a conjuncture of different tools. So for instance, we can do a bit of a magic wand, and that's going to do a fair bit of the heavy lifting for us. And then on areas like this, for instance, so that hasn't been selected down here, what I can come around and do is switch to a different selection tool and then hold down Shift and draw in the selection that I want to do. And that's going to add it to my selection, right? Same thing here. So I can go in here and really steady hands and kind of draw the rest of that in. And that's me just using a different selection tool in conjunction with the current one that I've got to get all those kind of different things. If I don't want to have these guys selected, I want to keep these guys separate from the background, I can tell Photoshop to deselect these things. So I do that by holding down Option or Alt, and you get the minus sign, and that's going to take away from my selection. So I've cut a hole now in that selection there. I want to undo that. And then just draw that back in. And I've taken away from that selection, and I'm kind of ready to go. So again, spending time kind of getting the right selection is going to be crucial depending on what you're doing and how you're kind of planning on working at it a little bit later on. Again, you can see it's not perfect. There are some areas that haven't been selected that I want, and others that I don't want that have been selected. So there's always a little bit of like, what's going on here? But again, can be relatively helpful. So I'm going to hit Command D, and that's going to deselect. And I'm going to show you guys this guy. So this is the magnetic lasso tool. And I'm just going to make this, it looks like a brush. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. So for those of you guys, again, like super like day one Photoshop class, to make a brush bigger or smaller is open and close square brackets. So open bracket makes it smaller, close bracket makes the brush bigger. So we're going to make that a little bit smaller. And what it will do is it will kind of detect the edge. So you can see how it's like kind of snapping to that edge because I'm following it loosely with my brush. If I obviously go over there, it's going to do some funky things. So you have to kind of follow the shape of that leaf, and it will magnetize to where it detects different pixels. So I'll just cut that off to there and close it off. So it's made this selection. It's kind of like the magic wand, except you've got a little bit more control because you're the person drawing it out. So it's still got a little bit of give and take. Again, it's not perfect.
Yeah, it's interesting with the getting to know the different tools and the different applications. Demis, for example, who has been on the live stream a lot, he almost always uses the magnetic lasso tool, and I was quite surprised.
Yeah.
But yeah, he'll it's almost his like 90% is his go-to. go-to tool. And I think to your point before, where you said people are often wanting high-res files, he shoots like in RAW with like the most, fantastic, professional cameras and stuff. So there might be something in that as well. It will depend on what you're working with.
And this is, incidentally, this is the whole point of a green screen, right? So if let's do a quick little kind of test here. If I take like something really like live green like this, which is the whole idea behind a live screen, a green screen, sorry, and I then have like, I don't know, let's say I'm going to have an orange, something that's really going to contrast super well. And I'm going to draw a selection in here real quick, just a random kind of blob shape. Okay, it's on the same layer, and to fill that, Photoshop is going to have very, very little very, very little difficulty discerning which one's which in here. So it's a really quick, easy way. If I use my Magic Wand tool, if I click on the green, it's gone bang and selected all the green. If I click on the orange, it's gotten all the orange. So it's like, that's the whole principle behind a green screen, is basically trying to make the person whose job it is to select an image and pick it off so that we can put a CGI background behind it a lot easier.
Cool.
So that's kind of a quick look at all these kind of different things. You can also, if you need to save a selection, like if you have made a selection and you've spent hours on it and it's perfect and you think that you might want to use it again later on, you can actually save a selection and then reload it. And you do that in your select menu, and you will go to save selection, and then we will just call it we'll just call it leaf, whatever, doesn't really matter, and go OK. And now if we deselect that and we work on it for hours and restart our computer and come back, I can go back into my select menu, load a selection, and say leaf, and it will reload that selection for me later on. So that's a really nice way to just if you, again, because as I said, you're going to spend potentially hours making this selection exactly the way you want, especially if you've got people who work in fashion magazines and all that kind of stuff, with people with hair and stuff that you're trying to cut out from the background. That's a lot of work. So you definitely want to save that work and save that selection for later on if you need to. And then last but not least, we have got the one that I probably use the most when we do this kind of stuff. And whenever I have to pick something off, is can do a bit of a quick rough selection here. And then I'm going to go to this thing underneath my colors here, which is called a quick mask. And the shortcut for that is Q. And you'll notice that my image goes a little bit red and see-through. And this is basically going to be like a mask. So we'll talk about masks a little bit later on in a lot more detail. But if you look at this, what it will allow me to do is automatically, you saw that I had orange and white, my colors. When I switch to that, it switches to black and white in my colors. And that's going to allow me to literally paint my selection in a bunch of different strokes, with a little bit of a feathered edge as well, so with a bit of a soft edge, which is going to be really handy for getting slightly lower res images that are going to have not so much of a hard edge. So that's going to be super handy for me to do. So white will add to the selection, black will take out of that selection. So anywhere you're seeing this red overlay is stuff that is not selected.
What's the shortcut to switch between the two, by the way?
Between the two foreground and background colors?
Background, yep.
X. So
It's
X switches between the two. Yeah, especially when you're doing this kind of masking work. Super, super handy. So you get the idea. That's all kind of been selected now. So if I make a big X, whatever, you'll see those things have been selected. So I'm literally painting a selection. So that would be the thing that I probably, me personally, would use the most, even though I don't do a whole lot of kind of photo editing. But the other thing that I want to kind of touch upon here is, with all these selections, if we are trying to do something like this and pick this leaf off the background, the thing that we're going to want to do is to use a layer mask. And this kind of allows me to introduce this idea of destructive versus non-destructive workflows. So again, assuming that I want to get rid of the background in this image and just preserve the leaf. Yeah. What I can do is I'll just switch this to, I'll just make it that orange background so you can see what's happening. The reflex would be, all right, we'll go in here, use my eraser tool, and literally erase the image in here. All right. So again, we covered this last week. When you see these kind of gray and white checkered squares, that means there's nothing happening. It's transparent. And because I've got an orange background, you'll see that orange. So I can do it this way, right? And erase the pixel. So visually, it's doing the same thing. It's working in the same way. It's making interesting things, and it's like, sure, that's fine. The problem is, as you saw here, I messed up a little bit. I went a little bit too far into here. And basically, I have deleted that pixel information. I can't get it back. That's gone now. Obviously, I can undo, right? I can undo a bunch of different times. But if I had closed and saved that file and reopened it, I've got no more undos. So I'm stuck with this. That's called destructive because you're destroying these pixels. So what you want to do, instead of doing that, is to use what's called the layer mask. And let me just close this because I have gone and destroyed all those pixels. So I'll just close and reopen it. What I want to do is create a layer mask to work on top of this. And then I can do a non-destructive workflow. So layer mask is in my layer panel. Down at the bottom in here, you've got this little like black square inside a white rectangle, and that's called add a layer mask. And this will happen. So in my Windows panel here, I've got this mask that's appeared. That's going to allow me to do something. So as of now, there's nothing that's happened to it. And you'll notice as well, like with all the masks that are going to happen in Photoshop, I've got orange and white. As soon as I click on make a layer mask, that switches to black and white down here. So now I can use my brushes and I can literally paint out a selection. So you'll notice that visually the same exact thing is going to happen. But from a file working perspective, and what you can see is if I do a really, really big one, you can see that's happened. That's previewing in my panel here. So it's adding to that specific thing. So what it's doing is basically saying, I'm going to put a transparent sheet on top. Anywhere you paint black, you're going to be cutting a hole in that sheet. Anywhere you paint white, you're going to be patching the hole in that sheet. And what you'll see here is what's really awesome is it's going to allow me, if I mess up over here, and have like that giant cut in my leaf, if I save come back later, all I need to do is switch to white again, and I can paint all that leaf information back in. And so what a mask does is it doesn't erase, it hides. And that makes all the difference. And that's a non-destructive workflow. And so always, if you can, work in a non-destructive workflow, whether you're working with a client, especially if you're working with a client on a professional file, client might request a change and then change their mind later on. And so if you've baked that change into your image and the client decides, actually, I've changed my mind, I don't want it anymore, you're going to be stuck having to redo potentially a lot of work because you've now baked that into that image.
There's some talk in chat of some people that working destructive. A lot of people are working non-destructive now, using things like layers. So, help them understand how important it is to work in a non-destructive way. I think that everybody that we have on Adobe Live, just about every professional we have on, always has all these stories about why working non-destructive is so much better and so time consuming. So it gives you, it allows you more time So I
Yeah,
think it's a really important thing to learn. It's definitely worth your time. It will save you time in the long run for sure.
it will. And like I said, like when you're working on a personal project where, there's no timeline or anything like that necessarily speaking, even though obviously, you want to be able to finish your work as well and finish your pieces. But more specifically, when you're working on a client brief and they ask you to do something, like I always use a lot more layers when I'm working on a professional client brief, so just in case my client changes their mind about something and decides they don't want it or they want to change the color of it or whatever. Always good to work in a non-destructive workflow, because then it will just save you heaps of time. So for instance, again, if my client decides like, you know what, I don't like the look of this leaf, can you get rid of it? If you go in and do that in a destructive workflow and like literally just delete it, and then later on they go like, actually, you know what, I've changed my mind. I didn't dislike that leaf as much as I thought.
It looks kind
If
of
you've gone
stupid
and
without a
erased it,
leaf there.
yeah, if you've gone and erased it, you're basically going to have to start the whole thing over again.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have done it on a layer mask or like in a non-destructive workflow, all you need to do is just go like, oh, yeah, sure thing, here, done, it's back in.
Yeah.
So non-destructive is definitely the way to go when you're doing this kind of stuff. And whenever possible, sometimes I kind of hack it. And if there's something that I need to do that is difficult to do in a non-destructive workflow, I will just make a duplicate layer. And so I've still got the save, or I'll save a copy of a certain state. So let's say at this stage now in my image, after working on it for like 20 minutes, I need to do something that's going to be a bit destructive. I might save this stage of the image and then make a copy of it and then continue working on that, so that I still have to redo some work, but less work.
Yeah.
So it's a good idea to kind of stay ahead of things with that kind of non-destructive workflow. So that's all kind of this idea of like making selections. And again, like as I'm doing this, as I'm painting, I'm literally just telling Photoshop, like, here's a selection, do stuff to these pixels. I'm using a specific brush on a layer mask. So it's that same operation of telling Photoshop these pixels, not these pixels. And oops, I screwed up on these pixels. Give me these pixels back, please. That's then going to allow us to cut that out. So rather than delete the information in the background, I'm just hiding it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So now I think what I'd like to jump into, we'll get into Lee Van Cleef in a little sec and start kind of talking about how we're going to do this. But what I'd like to talk about at this stage is color modes. And color modes in Photoshop is super important, as it is with Illustrator, but maybe a little bit less so in Illustrator, because you've got a little bit less control over the individual pixels in Illustrator, because Illustrator doesn't use pixels in a sense. It uses mathematics in the image, whereas Photoshop is each individual little pixel can have a specific thing done to it and only it, which gets a little bit kind of micromanagey, but also opens a lot of possibilities. So my work tends to be, as you guys can probably see from my Behance page and my website, I've got a lot of neon colors, a lot of really, really bright stuff happening. And so I generally work in RGB. So RGB versus CMYK is the two main color gamuts that you can have in Photoshop. And they live here in your image mode, RGB, CMYK. You've also got lab, multi-channel, grayscale, can be good if you're working with black and white photography. But these are probably the two that you'll be looking at the most. So RGB is red, green, and blue. CMYK is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Traditionally, when you're working for print, so anything that you're going to do that will be printed on paper, billboard, you name it, traditionally, it used to be the case that you had to work with CMYK, because that's how the inks in your printer, anybody who's got a desktop printer at home will know that when you buy the inks for it, you're usually buying cyan, magenta, yellow, and a black cartridge for your printer, depending on the model. So that's usually the standard. RGB, which is red, green, and blue, is how your screen works. So anybody who's doing web design, video, anything that's going to appear on a screen, traditionally would use RGB. And that used to be the case, that we would tell students in school is like always, 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 if you're going to print, only use CMYK. That's not the case anymore. My printer uses an RGB CMYK printer that has a lot more inks in it. And so they are able to print a much wider color gamut. And so here's how that kind of works real quick without getting too technical about it. This little kind of diagram shows you all the colors in the visual spectrum. So this little weird shape is all the colors that the human eye can see. The colors that are reproducible in the CMYK gamut are living in this black dash line, and the RGB is the yellow triangle. So you can see all these areas in here, all these colors are colors that exist if you're working in RGB that you can't get if you're working in CMYK. Same thing here, same thing on that side. So there's a much wider gamut. There's a lot more colors that are possible if you're working in RGB. And the real life kind of demonstration of this is this image. So you'll see, particularly on these vivid pinks and really kind of neon colors, which is, again, that's completely my jam. So it makes sense for me to work in RGB. So this is an RGB color. This is the image as you can see it in CMYK. So just to kind of show you guys, I've got a layer mask on this again, and I can move this around to show you. So that is CMYK difference of that. You can see on the blue, you can see on the pink down here, you can really kind of tell that difference of that kind of CMYK desaturates those images. Again, that's nothing to do with Photoshop. That's just the standard physics of color, where CMYK just can't translate certain colors. So when you work on your image,
it's a really cool way to show. I've never seen anybody show it like this before. It's super cool.
Yeah, and it's like, obviously, especially with my work, right? Like my work requires RGB, it like really screams out for it. If it's CMYK, things just fall flat. And I have a lot of clients who, who don't necessarily understand that, and that's fair enough. And they ask, we want those neon colors, but then we want to print it in CMYK, and it's just like, well, no, that's just not going to work. It's going to desaturate. It's going to look a little bit faded, simply because that's just physics. Talk to Neil deGrasse Tyson about it. He'll tell you. That's just how the real world works. Yeah, that'd be amazing if we could get him on the show. Such a big fan.
Got questions for you.
But yeah, so that is basically kind of CMYK versus RGB. So again, you can set that in your mode. Usually the kind of standard practice is to do it before the fact, simply because if you go, again, because RGB is bigger, you can go from big to small, just like with resolution. If you have a high res image, you can downgrade it to a lower resolution without losing any kind of content. But as soon as you want to go back from small to big, you're going to see some resolution issues. The same thing happens with CMYK. If you start with RGB and you translate it into CMYK, you're going to lose color information, which you won't get back if you switch back the other way. So with this CMYK image that I've got, if I decide later on, actually, you know what, in my image mode, I want to switch that back to RGB, it's going to stay looking like this, if that makes sense. And so you want to decide beforehand what you are going to do with your colors. Especially if you're working with RGB, you want to make your file and decide that when you're creating your new file, you want to work in your color mode in here. That will tell you RGB, CMYK, lab color. They're all the things that we saw in that menu. Make sure you're on RGB. Don't worry too much about this, 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit. 8 or 16 is usually fine. I usually work with 8. This will just significantly increase your file size, which visually won't do too much difference. So I usually work with 8 simply because it's just a nicer way to go. And that's kind of it. Last thing that I want to kind of talk about real quick is Pantone colors. So we're talking about clients, or we're talking about working with specific clients, or maybe working with brands. So let's say that you're working with Adobe, for instance. Adobe, the little red Adobe A logo has a specific red, which would need to be a Pantone swatch. So if you were a designer or an illustrator doing a job with Adobe, and they asked you to use that same red, you can't just eyeball it, because your screen might be calibrated a little bit differently. You might have it be brighter, it might be more yellow or blue, or warmer or cooler. And so we have to use what is called Pantone. So you guys might have seen these things before. So these guys are called Pantone swatches. So you might have, they're very popular among designers. They're a very kind of trendy thing to do. Every year Pantone releases its color of the year. I'm not sure what it is this year. I think last year it was emerald green. Which is just
this year
a
might
purely
be just brown.
Yeah, it's not a very happy year, is it? So those are your Pantone swatches, and what they are for, if you're kind of wondering, is they are a standard color book. So every printer would have this book where all the Pantone swatches are in it, and it gives them a code, and it gives them a little bit of a breakdown of the actual color. So whenever you look at a color in Photoshop, so I'm going to use my eyedropper, which is this guy, and that's going to take up that color. You have all this color information that appears. So we got RGB, how much red is in it, how much green is in it, how much blue is in it, how much cyan, magenta, yellow, black is in it. All these things are ink informations for your printer. And so when you're looking at this and sending it off to a printer, that can be a little bit tricky, because again, their screen might look a little bit different. Something on your screen that you think, yeah, that's awesome, when it sends it over to theirs, it actually prints how it would in the real world, and you get it back and you're disappointed with the color, because it's like all these kind of different color problems that can happen from screen to screen. So we avoid that by using Pantone swatches. And where those exist is, again, if you eyedrop that color and you want to match it, if your client's like, hey, what Pantone is that blue? You eyedrop it, double click on here and go to color libraries, and pick out of your color libraries in here, you want Pantone, solid coated or uncoated. Coated is just the kind of paper. Usually we go with coated or uncoated, either way. And that will immediately match that color to the closest possible Pantone. So it might not be perfect. You'll see on top is the current Pantone, on the bottom is the color that I chose. But if you're working with Pantone colors, if your client asks you to work with that, you have to switch to that one. And it might be a little bit of a shame, because you'll see that that is not as vivid. But again, this is super, super important. So you'll notice as well that the Pantone has a little code under it, so 311C. If you are working with Adobe and they are asking you to use Pantones, you will have to ask them, okay, well, send me the Pantone code so that I can use exactly the same one.
Yep.
All right, so that's all the different kind of color modes. And again, it's important to kind of touch upon these, because it is something that you guys have to do ahead of it. You have to kind of think ahead, because it's very tricky to do after the fact.
Yeah, cool. We're about 6.5 minutes till Q&A, so we can do that early, or we can keep going.
Yep.
It's up to you.
Let's jump into Q&A, because I'll jump into the next chapter now, so it makes sense to maybe get into some Q&A if we want.
Q&A, great questions coming in from chat. Decided to kind of wait until the Q&A break in the middle for some of these, because we knew we needed to kind of jump from one thing to the other in there. But going back when we're having a look at your website, Elizabeth's saying loves the neon glow on your website. Is that your character? Is that your character? Is the character your name? What does it actually say?
Which one? On my website? The kanji is the kanji for Lord, basically.
Lord.
Which is a little bit sort of open to interpretation. There's a better one that's more specific to that, but yeah, I've used that one because visually it's a little bit better, but it's actually technically inaccurate for you Japanese speakers out there. That kanji actually says man, or like human or person.
Right.
Lord is a slightly different one, but it fits a little bit better in there.
Nice.
But thanks for the comments on the work. Really appreciate it.
Malik didn't ask a question, but I'm just going to give you a shout out for saying Neil the grass-fed Tyson, because it makes
I've never made that connection.
Stefano's asking, do you calibrate the colors on your screen as well to make sure you have the right compatibility with the printed output?
So
you do. I have never calibrated a computer or screen before.
So I don't do it myself. So we've spoken about this a couple of times in previous streams about having a really good relationship with your printer, and how crucial that is. I am super good mates with my printer, and he is an amazing printer. He's amazing at what he does, and he uses a specific color profile. So in Photoshop, you can pick various color profiles, and so when we go to our color setting, or where is it? Profiles. I forget. It's one of those things that you set and then forget later on. Where is my profiles? I hate this. Think fast. Color settings, or is it profile? Assign profile. Yeah.
We can look into it like next.
Yeah,
stream.
well, I'll have to think about it because it's anyways. You can choose different color profiles for specific imagery. The one that I use because my printer uses on his screen. So when he looks at my files on his computer to be able to print them, he will see them in a certain way. So it's important for me to see what he sees, or for him to see what I see.
Right.
And so that becomes super accurate. So you want a printer to not just hit print on whatever you send them. If they detect an error in your file or something that they think, are you sure that's what you want? That looks a little bit too dark. It's like some people get a little bit antsy about that because they take it as, you're questioning my design. I am the creative, you are not. Just do what you're told. The problem with that is that when that happens, if you do make a mistake, all too often a printer will see a mistake and just be like, well, you know what? Not my problem. I'm just going to print what you sent me.
Yeah.
Which can be definitely problematic in a lot of cases. And so you want to have that dialogue with your printer. You want your printer to just go like, hey, just checking. This is how it looks on mine. This is all good. Or like, hey, there's a typo here, or you forgot this, or it's going to look like this, or I can't do that. You want to have that conversation with your printer and have them tell you these different things. And so when my printer sees a file and it's like, hey, that's really dark, that's almost black on my screen, having my screen calibrated to theirs makes that a little bit smoother. And so they have this little kind of like machine that like latches onto the front of your screen that has a little camera built into it, and it flashes all these different colors, and it calibrates the screen to match as close as possible to what the print is then going to translate the image to. So screen calibration is all too often overlooked, especially because it's one of those things that's like, what comes out of your screen needs to be as close as possible to what comes out on paper. And so calibrating your screen makes all that difference. But I use the profile that I use is Adobe RGB. It's a pretty standard color profile. It comes with everything. It's great for obviously RGB work. I use that profile because that's the profile that my printer recommended. So yeah, if you have a printer that you use quite often, ask them to either come over and calibrate your screen, or bring your screen into them and have it calibrated, or ask them what color settings they would recommend for their work, and so on and so forth. It just means that there's a much more translation, and there's a lot less lost in translation between your screen and your printer's machine.
Yeah, be kind to your printers. Hug a printer. Have you hugged your printer today?
Yeah.
Take them out for a beer.
Especially if you're a digital artists, right? If you're not painting on canvases and stuff,
Mm,
if your printer prints your work badly, then your work will look bad.
mm,
And so yeah, having a good printer and having a good relationship with your printer as a digital designer, digital artist, is like if I had a bad relationship with my right hand, like trying to draw. This is the thing that makes what happens in my brain come to life and look really good. So
mm,
if you want it in that analogy, like I am the brain and my printer is the hand.
mm.
So if there's a lack of communication there, if there's not a lot of kind of flow, if we're not getting on, um, yeah, bad things are going to happen. That's not how I imagine the image. What gives?
Yeah, cool. I like it. I like it a lot. There was a question about how did you make the neon light glow, which I think was we quickly looked through some of your work, and that is the
Yeah.
problem of looking at some of your work is that it's so striking and interesting. If we're trying to kind of focus in another area, it's like, whoa, that's super cool. How did you do that? We actually have done a couple of streams, I think, where you've gone into detail about
Yeah.
the neon glow. So we'll get a link
I
to
can
one of
just
those if you want to
show. I
show
can
a
just show
quick
that
version.
super quick. So neon glow works like this. So if I've got a stroke, right, a little bit knobbly, but whatever. So I've got that color. I will double click on that layer, which will bring up my layer styles. I'll go to outer glow, and that's already not too bad. So my blend mode is linear dodge. Opacity, we can play with that as we need to, depending on how glowy we want it. And then I'll put an inner glow inside and decrease the size down. Whoops, sorry, inner glow. And decrease that down to match a little bit more. And that's how you get a glow. Bear in mind
Nice.
that if you want that glow effect, you need a dark color behind it. Otherwise, it will just not look good at all. So that's on white.
Right.
That's on the dark color. It like neons don't work at daytime. So yeah, you need the night. I require the solace of the nighttime.
I like it. That's great. 30 seconds, how to create a glow. So there you go. But yeah, there's
Yeah,
some more
but as
detailed
you said,
stuff
we've covered
about
that a bunch of times.
in detail. So we'll share a link to that soon in chat. Jan was asking, can you use hex values instead of Pantones, or a hex only for screen?
That's a good question. I'm not a web designer. I think hex is the web equivalent, so it's the web code
Yeah, I think
for
so.
the color.
Yeah.
So when you go in here on your color, you will see this little guy down here. So hexadecimal is 6 digits and numbers, which is always the code, like a hexagon. That is usually the code that web designers use for colors. So black is 00, white is FFF, like all these kind of standard colors that you'll see. But you can use these, but I think I could be wrong. Again, I'm not a web designer. I think these are usually just reserved for web swatches and web design, and by proxy screen. But again, happy to be told that's not the case.
Yeah. Cool. That's us. I think we can jump into part 2. Thanks for answering
All
my
right.
questions.
Thanks for the questions, and yeah, again, like keep them coming as we're going through. It's always super cool to hear all these questions. So we're going to jump in here and do this guy in a specific style with the lasso tool. So again, we're not necessarily going to get too much into style and what it means and all these different things. We've spoken about that a few times over past live streams, and we'll continue to do so quite extensively. But having a certain look, a certain kind of feel to an image is crucial as an illustrator. And so I used to do this thing with the polygon lasso tool with these really kind of cut out edges and flat colors. And it just gives it a bit of a look. But the really cool thing about this is, provided you've got a drawing or you've done a drawing by hand and you scan it in. So in this case, I've done this digitally, but for all intents and purposes, it could just be a pencil drawing that I've scanned in. And for how to do that, check last week's tutorials. But what I will do with this is I will use the polygon lasso tool, which is the lasso tool, except I'm clicking once to do this, to the thing. It's not like with the regular lasso tool where you click and drag and it draws a selection freehand. The polygon lasso tool, and by the way, I'm accessing these by clicking and holding down, and it pops out this menu, and then you can go in here. So if you click and hold, it pops out this menu. If you just click once, it'll just select that tool. Or the command shortcut for that is L, as you can see on my screen. If I press Shift L, it will cycle through the different tools in here, which is always a really kind of handy. Shortcuts are the spice of life. So learn the ones that you use quite frequently. I use this one quite frequently, so I have learnt it. But I'm going to use the polygon lasso tool, which is less of a click and drag and more of just a click and point. So click once, go to where you want to go, click again, and it just makes these solid shapes. The reason why is maybe a little bit of kind of style and flavor to the image, but also the really cool thing, and this is great if you're a beginner and you haven't had the money to buy a Wacom or a Cintiq or equivalent, which is a drawing tablet, which is what I've been using.
It comes up quite a lot, I think, like, because I think a lot of people will see people such as yourselves, like professionals or even graphic designers, using a stylus or a Wacom and thinking, well, I can't, can I do that? How can I kind of get my hands dirty with some illustration techniques without investing? And they're fairly affordable now. We talk about them a lot on stream, but still, it's if is it something that you need before you can get started? So it's always great to see other methods and techniques you can use without the pressure sensitivity and accuracy of a stylus of some kind.
Yeah, and look, I think like we've spoken about this a bunch of times, but they are affordable, but it's still a solid investment. But if you are going to go into a sort of illustration career as a freelancer, like it's required, absolutely required. Unless you have a certain style and look and feel, you're going to need one of these that's going to allow you to do this kind of sketching really like super easily. But again, the really cool thing about this particular kind of style that I will show you guys now is you can do this with a mouse. You don't have to have a stylus to do this because you're not drawing, you're just clicking once, and then you have all this time to decide where's the next point going to be, and then where's the next one going to go. And so you can totally just do this with a mouse without having to like sweat too much over like using a stylus. And I'd actually even suggest that it's probably easier to do this particular kind of style with a mouse than with a stylus, because sometimes a Wacom won't necessarily register the click and it gets a little bit kind of funky, and then you got to double click, whereas a mouse is actually easier with this particular kind of look and feel that we're going for today. So it's one of the big pluses of this particular kind of thing is you can totally just do it with a mouse. Yeah. So we've got our little Lee Van Cleef, the good, the bad, and the ugly reference pick. We've got our drawing, which I've kind of exaggerated
like
a little bit.
Spaghetti Western kind of actor.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Absolutely. He's in that like super famous, I think they call it the Truel, because it's like a duel but with three people, so it's like a trio duel. The scene in the cemetery at the end where the good, the bad, and the ugly are just having a bit of a standoff. And this like scene is him kind of looking from one to the other, deciding like who's going to shoot me, who am I going to shoot. It's just like I've taken this particular image because he's got this really kind of like wrinkly, craggly face, good for like westerns, and good for this kind of style as well. Don't do this with your airbrushed models from fashion magazines. It won't really look the same. It's just we need somebody like, like a Dalai Lama or a Mother Teresa, like somebody really kind of craggly and lots of like character in their face to kind of do something like this. All right, so we're going to just jump straight in. So I got my drawing on a separate layer. It's on a lowered opacity. And what I can do here is normally what I would do if you were doing painting traditionally is you would lie down the basic color and then draw on top of that all the added detail. So essentially, you would start with my yellow, and then I could add some of the brown, and then the white, and then last would go the blacks. With this, I need to work backwards, so I need to work with my outlines first, and then I can go in and add layers behind it. The problem is if I start kind of doing things a little bit too basic, I might lose some of the detail a little bit later on. So first things first is going to be those kind of things. And again, like with this, and again, this is more kind of style, I don't want to be too kind of clean with this. I want to just keep it relatively rough, and then I'll close that selection off. So as soon as you see that little O next to my cursor, see that? That means I'm gone back to the point of origin. If I click, it'll close that selection, and I've got my selection ready to go. And then I can fill this with my foreground color. So I want to use black for now. We can change that a little bit later on. I'll use black. And again, I can go to Edit, Fill, Foreground Color, Return. That's too many buttons to press. I don't have time for that kind of shenanigans. And so I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut, which is Option Delete.
I just got to mention, as we are in Photoshop and we have the Photoshop guru in chat, Jesus Ramirez. I'm sure many of the people that are used to Adobe Live have seen his amazing videos. I've learned a lot of stuff over the years from Jesus, but it's great to have you in chat, my friend. And if you want to learn anything in Photoshop, basically go to the Photoshop training channel, because he knows things about Photoshop that people at Adobe don't know about Photoshop. So good to see you.
Well, now I'm nervous.
I know. I was about to say. I was like, yeah. No pressure at all.
Yeah. We spoke about this last week, actually, and it's something that's super interesting with Photoshop. Like, I know Photoshop for what I do in Photoshop, which is not like, it's by no means would I ever claim that I know everything about Photoshop and what all the menus do and what everything, like all that does. I know Photoshop for illustration, and not only that, I know Photoshop for my specific kind of illustration that I do. I think that's really important to remember as well when you're learning Photoshop is, you're going to look at all these menus and pop-outs and everything and just go like, oh my God, I have to learn all this stuff. I have to know what each one does and memorize. It's like, no, you do absolutely not have to memorize all of them. You will be a photographer, or you will be an illustrator or a web designer or anything like that. And you will know the things that you need to know in Photoshop to do what you need to do. Like you mentioned Demis before, like he would know, switches and buttons in Photoshop that I have no idea exist, because he does a different thing to what I do in Photoshop. So he needs it for different things. Similarly, I would imagine that there are certain things in Photoshop that I know that he doesn't know. Sorry, Demis, maybe that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. No, but it's true.
But
it's true, because it's such a, you go.
You just need to know what you need to know. Like,
yeah,
you just need to do what you need to do, and that's it. So, yeah, still having an actual Photoshop expert in the chat does make me a little bit nervous. So we're just literally like carving in and out here of our image, and just adding in, taking out, just kind of doing really kind of rough cuts to our image. And I'll speed this up a little bit. And again, if I want to kind of take out here, I can just make a selection and then just hit delete, and that will edit that. I can add to it if I want to. There's a whole range of different things, again, depending on how detailed I want to go at this stage, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's the basic kind of gist of this kind of style. And now the only ingredient, the only like technique that remains now is just time spent doing this for quite a while, depending on how kind of detailed and intricate that image is. But yeah, now it's just kind of rinse and repeat idea. So let's kind of move ahead a little bit and make a new layer. So I'm going to name this layer. Always really important to name your layers. and I can start to add some different colors into here and kind of see where we go with it. So with colors, what we're looking at with colors is we're going to need to kind of pick, especially with something like this, I'm going to have to pick colors are going to look a little bit alike. So the image that I showed you guys before, the finished one is kind of warm colors. So it has that kind of Western look to it. This wouldn't necessarily work with neons, obviously, like, 80s pinks and blues and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't really fit the subject matter here. But we've got a lot of kind of colors that work together here. They're on the same side of the color wheel, right? So the warmish reddish brown, the yellow, the cream, all these colors kind of live in the same kind of neighborhood in the color wheel. But what we can do, and that's intentional, obviously, because I'm looking for that vibe, something to really kind of pop this off is going to be to add in a little bit of a highlight somewhere. So I've picked this blue because the blue lives on the opposite side of the color wheel to all the colors that I've selected here, and really is going to allow me to kind of bring a bit of a more kind of painterly, interesting element to this image. And so that's more of a kind of a little bit of a highlight. And so what we talk about with color when we're working with it is the 60-30-10 rule, which we've mentioned before in the stream. Is this is my 60%. So 60% of my image is built of this yellow. 30% is this kind of maroon color. And then a quick 10% is just going to be a slightly, like, this is the mustard on the meal, if you want to, again, another food analogy, but steak and chips is 60% steak, 30% potatoes, and then 10% mustard or ketchup or whatever sauce you like to put on your dish, salt, just to kind of bring that little extra zing into it. So again, if that color is too similar to all the other colors, it won't have the same impact. And we'll get to this menu in just a tick, but again, see, like if I bring a slightly kind of similar tone in here, it just doesn't have that same impact. So we need something that's going to be really like quite different here, but in keeping obviously with the themes that we're kind of working with. So again, I can decide early on, like I'm looking for this kind of vibe. So I'm looking again for these kind of warm tones that we can kind of work with. And they are going to help me kind of get this whole idea out the door. So again, I can be quite rough here and really work quite loosely. And I don't have to be particularly accurate with my sketch at this stage, because again, I've kind of caricaturized Lee Van Cleef. He's got the really sharp face, is very prominent, cheekbones, very sharp nose, tiny eyes. It's basically like, a director who's looking for a bad guy in a Western movie. Lee Van Cleef is perfect, which is pretty much why he's only ever played bad guys in Westerns. So he's got that kind of that feeling there. So I don't need to be too careful with this. I can be a little bit a bit more freeform with what I'm doing. And that's now going to be my base. And then I can just keep adding layers as I go and trying out different tones and colors to kind of match with what I'm doing. The light's coming in from the left over here, so we can kind of make sure that we're playing around with that and adding in all that kind of different stuff here. So again, like style here is going to be really key and quite important, and how the image kind of looks and all that. And you can see, like, I'm really just like slapping down these shapes very kind of willy-nilly. Just get a little bit of that highlight on the cheekbone to differentiate it from the neck. And there we go. So again, like this, I quite like this style. There's a bit of, if you guys are familiar with Sol Bass, one of my favorite designers. He did all the Hitchcock posters back in the days. Very kind of simple cutout kind of vibe. When I graduated from college, I was a big fan of that kind of style. And so that kind of led me into doing a lot of imagery in that same kind of vibe. Yeah. And yeah, again, one of the key features here is just like not spending too much time on getting it to be accurate and detailed. Like you want that kind of like super simple look for this.
Yep, totally.
All right. So that, again, that will just be me for a little while here, kind of working it in, adding the highlights, making new layers for all these different things, and just kind of working from that photo up here just to kind of make sure all that works the way that I need it to, and putting all the highlights where I see them based on that. So again, just building up the layers and building up the detail in this image until eventually we're in a good spot. But something else that I want to kind of touch upon real quick is another style, and a lot of comic book artists use this. Same idea to what I'm doing here, but let's bring Lee back into it's kind of like Blade Runner vibes a little bit and make him a little bit neon. And so we're going to give him a bit of a nighttime thing. Just quickly, we spoke about this last week as well. I've made this color. This blue color, I picked it out. I don't feel like it's dark enough at this stage. It's a bit too complementary. So rather than go back into my menu and pick another one, I'm actually going to select that layer and hit Command U. And that's going to bring this image adjustments hue sat. And you can see that shortcut just there, Command U. And that's going to let me kind of play with the darkness and maybe slightly get a slightly more interesting tone, something with a little bit more warmth to it, like a purple. Don't mind that, actually. So this is more of a kind of like, I don't know what color I want. I kind of have an idea, but I'll see it. I'll know it when I see it. Command U, hue sat slider allows you to do that super, super well. So yeah, so that gives me a little bit of a thing to play around with. So the technique that I want to show you guys now is basically the same thing. So making a selection. So let's say that I want to get a really cool like reflection on the bottom of his cheek here, because there's going to be like some crazy neon panel sitting there. Completely doesn't fit the theme, but who cares? So we're just going to make this shape on the side of his face. Again, if I was to play around with this, I might go back in and save that selection, just to kind of bring it back up a little bit later on. Up to you guys how you guys want to do this. But instead of filling, what I can now do is, let's pick a kind of a nice bright color here. What I can now do is I can apply a gradient to this. And I can apply a gradient using my gradient tool, so this one. By default, gradient goes from foreground to background. So it's that blue to black slider up here, because those are my background and foreground colors down here. If I change one of those, it'll change up here. What I want is foreground to transparency, which is the second one over. And that goes from my foreground color to nothing. And so next to that, I've got all these different options of what kind of gradient I want. And when you're doing this, it could be tempting to just go for the straight up like bar gradient, which does this, it's just kind of a soft gradient in a straight line. But that's going to be a bit tricky. If I want to apply something to the side here, as soon as I go down here, it's going to make some weird things down here. So I actually want to use the radial gradient, which is the next one over. And that allows me to apply gradients a lot more locally, a lot more kind of evenly throughout that.
What was that one called? I kind of
that's called the radial gradient up here.
Radial, okay.
So you've got linear, radial. These ones don't worry too much about. Basically, these are a little bit for kind of for effect. There's some use to them, but generally speaking, you'll probably use either one of the two first ones if you're doing something like this. So that's always a kind of an interesting one to use. And generally you'll see, if you ever look at a kind of a video tutorial of somebody using like comic book art, what they will do is they will create, using selection tools, they'll create these kind of shapes, rough shapes like this, and then either use the gradient tool to kind of fill them in with these kind of soft highlights, or they might even just use a brush, like a soft edge brush, to do the same thing and get a really kind of nice look and feel. So we're going to jump in and use that kind of soft edge brush, like so. Yeah, shape dynamics, and then we can lower the opacity to something a little bit lower, and that's going to give us basically a kind of a nice soft gradient brush. What's happening here? Why are you not as smooth as I'd like you to be? Drop the flow a little bit, and get rid of pen pressure as well, might as well. Okay. So you can use this to get a little bit more control on your gradient, and it feels a little bit more kind of painterly. And that really is like the ultimate control that you can have on something like this. So again, as we were kind of speaking about in the beginning, we have made a selection. We have told Photoshop, I want you to do things to this area and this area only. And then you go and do the thing that you want to happen in that area. And that's a pretty standard technique for a lot of digital comic book artists, just making a selection and then painting a gradient within it. It just gets you these really kind of nice soft tones that you're looking at. Right, let's get rid of all that. That's starting to look a little bit wacky. Next thing I want to kind of show you guys is...
Sorry, there was just one question on the shapes. Johanna was asking, would you ever consider adding some texture to the edge of those shapes?
As in, like making like
the
a
highlights
bit of
you were doing,
yeah.
Like would you put in like a half tone, or would you put in any textures or fade out to a texture or something? Is that something you would do?
Sometimes,
or would you do that later? Or some other time?
That's definitely something I would do. I probably would do that a little bit later. And adding a halftone in here to just add a little bit of like texture to that shading, if you will. But again, it really just depends on what we're trying to do. So I can show you if we've got time. I think we've got about like half an hour left.
About half an hour. Yep.
So I might show you just how to kind of hack a halftone in Photoshop in a sec. But what I want to kind of show as well is adjustment layers and how to kind of use adjustment layers in a kind of a non-destructive way. So again, I am just going to make the shadow kind of come up to the hat here, and I can actually I'll use a halftone on the shadow of the hat, which kind of lives up here in a sec, but let's just do that. Now let's say that I want this shape is the right shape. I want that, but I actually want it to be a little bit darker at the top. So there's a bunch of different ways I can go about doing this. I could potentially just do what I just did before and use a brush on that and just kind of paint a little bit of the darker tone at the top. That would totally be possible for me to do. But what I want to do actually is that's a little bit destructive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it non-destructively. And I'm going to add a different color to this in a non-destructive way. Because again, if I come in and paint on top of this, or like, let's say I'm going to grab my darker tone and I'm going to add a little bit of warmth to this by kind of taking that color in here and then using my brush to paint this in, right? So by the way, I have locked the transparency on this layer, which means that instead of doing this, I'm only painting within the actual shape that I created beforehand, if that makes sense. So you do that by clicking this little checkerboard up here, or keyboard shortcut is / It locks it. And that means that you can kind of do this thing really easily. I can also use a gradient to do the same thing, which kind of gives us a really cool effect. But again, that's destructive because it's not super destructive. Like there's not a lot of work that I would have to do to undo that. But if the client decides, actually, you know what, I want that color to be a different fill, or I want that purple to be a different color, that's going to be super tricky, right? So if they decide like I want that color to be like a green, I'm going to have a hard time doing that, and we're still going to see some of that green, that purple in there. So that's a little bit destructive because I'm taking away from the pixels that I originally created on here. Instead of that, I'm going to go on my layer. I'm going to go next to where the layer mask is. There's this one, which is create new fill or adjustment layer. And I'm going to click on that. And generally speaking, in this panel, you will see the same options that you would see in your image adjustments, where the adjustments just apply directly to the image. So for instance, if I do hue sat to this image, that's destructive because I'm changing the color. But if I hit return and the client's like, actually, I wanted the other color better, I've changed my mind again, you don't have that color anymore.
Clients don't change their mind like that, do they?
No, never. That never happens. They always know exactly what they want when they walk through the doors. So we're going to go in and apply an adjustment layer non-destructively, and we're going to just pick hue sat, and it's going to pop up the same window, just in a slightly different format. And you'll see that as I change this, it's going to change the entire image. It is changing the actual brown, but it's also doing it to the whole image. And I don't want that. I only want it to apply to the layer directly beneath it. So this can be really awesome if you're kind of creating an image and you're not too sure on the colors, or you're a little bit bored of them. This can be a nice like swooping change of like, hey, you know what, that's kind of cool. Maybe if the purple was a bit darker, but then I can go and change that individually later on. So this is something that I actually use quite often, is just let me give myself a bit of a fresh look on this and see what the colors are kind of doing. But in this instance, so let's say that I want like this color, make it a bit darker. Yeah, that's happy. That pleases me. So I'm going to say then I'm going to click this button just here. The adjustment layer is only to the layer directly beneath it. So as you can see in my panel here, the adjustment layer is applied here and the layer has gone there. If I click this, it will only do it to the layer directly beneath it, and you'll see this little icon appear onto it. It says down on this layer only. So it's not impacting my yellow or my purple. Yeah.
Cool.
The really cool thing about this is if the client decides they want to change their mind, you can just go, cool, yeah, that's it. It's gone back to my other color. I can go back in and change it to a different one if I need to, just at the click. So yeah, adjustment layers are really like an invaluable tool for working non-destructively. Better yet, they come with a layer mask baked into them. So this layer mask on the adjustment layer was just created when I click that button. If I click on that mask, I now have, again, you can see I've got my green and red. As soon as I click on the mask, it goes to black and white. Now I can use my gradient tool to mask all this stuff out down here. And that's going to give me this kind of soft edge effect. That's going to give me the kind of shadow on the hat is a little bit darker, goes to a slightly warmer color at the bottom. And I'm just using my gradient tool like I showed you guys before, and you can see that preview up here. The nice thing is, if I went too far, I can just switch back to white and bring my gradient tool back in and just pop these guys back into it.
Yeah.
And again, I can just turn it off. I can double click on this and change the color later on if I need to. I'm kind of digging that blue, actually. That's a nice little kind of 10% color that I can use. So that's an adjustment layer. And the nice thing about it, again, is if I come in with that same color and I start adding more shapes into here, that adjustment layer will already be applied to whatever shape. It's just waiting for things to happen underneath it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's just a really like super invaluable tool for editing images and editing all these different kind of things in a non-destructive way, because this hasn't been baked in. It's just sitting on top.
And I really think that like working in a non-destructive way like allows us to like have the freedom to try lots of things in a short amount of time, which increases your ability to kind of test, oh, is that working? Is this working? You know, without it being like the be all and end all, or taking so long that you think, okay, that's good enough. I'm going to have to move on to something else now.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like you said, it allows your client that freedom as well of asking for things without having the fear that it's like, whoa, what if it's the wrong thing that I asked for? Then is it going to be easy to turn back? Yeah, you're working digitally. You want to keep your options as open as possible for you to make those changes later on. That's the kind of the whole point of digital is, making your workflow easier for yourself and faster and more apt to changes. Whereas when we're looking at the kind of old school way of like painting on canvas, if you want to make a change, you got to repaint the whole image.
Yeah, exactly.
And then wait for the paint to dry. All right, so probably a good idea to save the image at this stage as well. If you're working on something that you decided that you really like, it's always a good idea to hit the save button.
How often do you hit the save button? Do you just catch yourself just then and think, oh, haven't saved it once?
I actually save quite often, depending on what I'm doing. Because we're doing a tutorial, and I'm not going to be using this image in the end. That's probably why I'm not saving as much as I normally would. But yeah, if I was working on something, I actually save the image when it's just at the canvas stage, when it's literally just a white image on its own. That's when I save, and then I've just got the thing, and just because I'm a little bit lazy and I don't want to have to redo the gigantic 3 steps that it takes for me to create a new canvas in Photoshop. But it's all about like time saving and management and all that kind of stuff, and working in a way that just makes your life easier. And so it makes my life easier, so that's what I do.
There's a question from chat. Jeremy, what do you do to roughen the skin on the face? So presumably if you wanted to add in texture to roughen the skin.
Yeah, so you could do a few different things here. You could bring in a texture from somewhere else and overlay that on top to give it that kind of western-y vibe if you wanted to.
Leather.
Because it is a little bit clean. Yeah, a little bit kind of leathery kind of vibe. There's a bunch of different ways that you could do. You could try and add a filter. Let's see if this works. Filter, noise, add noise. And that kind of, it's probably a little bit too much, but it just kind of gives it that slight sort of graininess to the image, which kind of takes away from the cleanliness of it all. But the reality is, because I'm working with flat shapes and clean outlines, it's always going to have that kind of clean look to it. But yeah, you could totally find a texture of like old paper, for instance, and bring that in on top and put that on multiply. In fact, let's do that right now.
We've got some Red Dead Redemption fans in the chat that
getting
some Red Dead vibes from this.
Definitely. The subject matter and the style of illustration that Red Dead used in theirs is very much akin to that. So I've got a whole like resource files of some textures in here used, and I think I've got one down here. Yeah, old paper. This one is going to be great. So just pop that in here, stick it on top, and put it on multiply. And so that's just giving it a little bit of that kind of grunge,
straight away,
Western kind of vibe to it. But it's changing the colors a little bit as well on the background. So I'll have to contend with that. But definitely on the face, it's.
Sorry, do you keep like a giant folder full of like textures and things like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And brushes and vector patterns that I've created in Illustrator to kind of add in very quickly at the drop of a hat. Yeah, absolutely. That's it's part of your kind of repertoire of images that you can use and add to as you go along, for sure. It just saves a bit of time, and yeah.
Cool.
All right, let's
just let you know we've got about 20. Time is a little bit off. We've got about 20 to 23 minutes or something.
Cool.
I'll fix that.
All right.
It's like my one job, and I've got it wrong. So
it's all good. So yeah, so that kind of style that we just kind of spoke about, that's applicable for like stuff like this as well. So this one is done in that same way, with the same tool, just applying a whole range of different things, to get this same kind of vibe. So working from a photograph, composing the image in a way that's going to be a little bit more kind of creative and work for me.
Wow, how many layers is in this thing for it to take so long to
It's
load
a
up?
huge one. It's a huge one. Not now. So yeah. So again, that kind of like vintage poster style, where you can see I've used that exact same texture that I just actually used before, has gone on to this to
Right.
just give it that kind of look and feel. I'm using that polygon lasso tool. I've got adjustment layers on a bunch of different things. You're getting a good look at how messy my layers can get and how often I will try things and see what happens. But again, that's that's the one of the beauties of working digitally, as well as a kind of one of the downsides of it. So yeah, it's just to kind of like give you guys a bit of an idea of kind of the way that you can do stuff with this particular tool, something quite simple. But what I want to look at now is type. So I got a little bit of type in this image. I'm going to add some type to this one. So this image is like relatively finished. I've done a few different things here. Oh, and I said I'd show you guys how to make a halftone effect as well. I'll do that right now, and then we can jump into a little bit of type, and that'll probably take us to the end. So I've created a layer here that's just on a lowered opacity, which is just this color, lowered opacity, to give that kind of the shadow of the hat, if we will. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that 100%. And halftones work in a way that's just like basically trying to emulate gray or certain color using only another color, right? So if we want like if we've only got black as a color to use, how do we get a soft gray using only black? Is with a halftone. And we do all these dots, and the closer the dots are together, the darker that color will seem, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go with something quite dark. Normally the standard is about 50% on in between gray. So smack bang in the middle of white to black, we got 50%. I want something a little bit darker than that. And we're going to just do that. I'm going to lock that layer and fill it with my gray. So that at the moment looks a little bit kind of weird and crunky, but bear with me. So now I've got my gray. That's going to speak halftone a lot more easily than any other color would. I'm going to go to Filter, Pixelate, Color Halftone. And again, this is where like we do this every now and then, where I request a feature from Adobe to add into Photoshop. I'd love a little preview button down here, guys. Like that would be absolutely awesome to kind of see, because at the moment I have to do the whole thing and then hit OK and then see what happens. And then if it's not right, I need to go back in and do the thing. Having a little preview down here would be absolutely fantastic.
I remember the last one was with Liquify. It was the same. It was to have the background, not just
being able to liquefy
the
with the background image behind it.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll run it upstairs. I have direct line straight to the top, no problem.
It's a little red Adobe Red phone. So we're going to change the radius here to like 12. Again, this is like this depends on the size of your image. It's 12 pixels. So if I've got a low res image, it's going to do different things. If I've got a high res image, it's going to change the size. But we'll play with 12 for now. And this is the important bit here. We're going to change every single channel to 45 degrees. And that's going to mean that it's just black, because otherwise you'll start to see the CMYK breakdown of each one of these channels. So we don't want that. So we're just going to put them on 45 degrees each and hit OK. And that's done our halftone. Not too bad. We got the dots are relatively close together, and it's looking pretty good, and it's black and white. So at the moment it looks a little bit kind of strange. So the last step I need to do is put that layer on multiply, and I've got that look, and that's given me kind of, it's still black, so it's not an extra color that you're using. If you're using screen print, that will just still count as one color, but you've managed to get a slightly different tone on top of it. So yeah, these days what I do is I actually do these in Illustrator and then bring them in as is in Photoshop to add to them. Yeah, so Illustrator has a much better kind of option for creating halftones like this. This is also where, by the way, if I wanted to edit this out, I could apply a layer mask to this, and I could come back in and carve some of these out using my layer mask, and it's just going to carve into that halftone, but it's not lost. So if I bring it back in, I still have that halftone pattern ready to go. So again, non-destructive, much easier than working in a destructive way. So let's bring the eyes back out because the eyes are important. The eyes are the windows of the soul.
This color halftone version rather than using a halftone brush, like, you know, from True Grit Textures?
Yeah,
or
so there's a
that?
Bunch of halftone brushes. I would use this simply to save time because I'm looking for a really uniform look throughout.
Right.
A lot of the halftone brushes are really cool because they give you this kind of worn, like real comic book halftone kind of vibe. And so these are for instance, these are the Carl T. Webster ones. So screen tones, we've got something like this, for instance. So this is a screen tone brush that he's created, and we're on a mask, and we're doing the wrong things. Get your act together. So yeah, so it looks like this, right? So that's a really simple one. That's a great one that Carl T. Webster has created. So I could use that. Again, there's not really any kind of right or wrong here to do this. He's got some bigger ones, some looser ones. Exactly the same thing, just potentially a little bit faster to do. So with my halftone, what I've done is I can actually make a selection quickly and then fill that. Whereas with a brush, I actually have to go in and paint it. So it's just like it takes a little bit of extra time to fill in that step. So again, it just depends on what the look and feel is that you're trying to go for. But both ways are right. Some of them, in some ways, it'll be faster for one thing, it'll be slower for another thing. But yeah, so it's up to you. Cool. So just quickly, I want to add some type to this image. I'll get rid of this kind of manga style because it doesn't really kind of click. So Photoshop and type, you probably shouldn't think about Photoshop type too much because really it's not, like if you're doing type work, Illustrator is going to be more where you're going to be playing because it's vector, because there's more things that you can do with it and it's easier to handle. But there is a type tool in Photoshop. And there's some interesting stuff that you can do with it that is possible in Illustrator, but a lot harder to do. So let's use this type tool, and I'm going to pick a specific typeface that I know kind of works well with this, and we're just going to type in some stuff here. So you'll notice that when I've typed it in, it's immediately created a new layer, and it doesn't matter what point size I do it at. It's just going to stay because it's a live type, and we'll talk about live type versus not in a sec. We've got this happening, which is quite cool, right? So it's just a type tool. It's not vector, so it's going to be constrained to certain rules of bitmap versus vector as in resolution. So you've got to keep that in mind, which is why you generally don't do type in Photoshop. But it is possible. So we got this. We can do a range of different things to this, but what I want to show you guys is the perspective type. So type in kind of perspective to add in a little bit of depth to this image and a bit of range with it as well. And this is where it needs to be a little bit destructive. Unfortunately, you can change this to fit a certain size. And you can also start putting it on an angle like this. But I can't put it in perspective, right? So the difference is this. Let me just make a copy of this. So Command J will duplicate that layer. So I've now got two. And I'm going to right click on the layer and it brings up my options. And I'm going to say rasterize type. Don't ask me why rasterize. I'm not sure. It's just that's just the glossary of terms. This will change it from a type layer. So this is now a type live type. You can see it's got that little icon. This is basically just an image that I've painted. So it's not type anymore. So if I click on this and change the typeface or the letters, I can't do that anymore. Whereas this one, I can change the font or the point size or whatever because it's live type. But the difference is with this one, if I hit Command T to transform and I hold down Command or Control, I can start doing these things to it. But where my live type had that happening, and I could do the same thing, what I can't do with my live type is this. So take one of the corners instead of one of the edges, and I can actually make that a little bit bigger and make that in perspective. You'll see that I'm losing a little bit of resolution. That's one of the issues with doing this.
Actually stretching the pixels out.
Exactly. So that's always a kind of a thing with this. Unfortunately, I've destroyed the type here, right? So you can go from live type to raster. You can't go back from raster to live type. So this is destructive, but unfortunately there's kind of no other way around this kind of idea when we're working with type in Photoshop. You can do this in Illustrator. It's not as live, so it's like you kind of have to do this thing that I did with the halftone where you click the button and then it does the effect, so you don't see it as you're doing it. But yeah, there's always a little bit of, again, a bit of give and take. The advantage with all of this is that I can now apply a texture to this if I wanted to, and really get a sense of grit with this. And how are we going for time?
Got about 10 minutes. We got exactly 10 minutes left.
Cool. All right, I'll show you guys how to do that, and that'll take us to the end. So we're going to add a little bit of grunge to this typeface in Photoshop. So I'm going to go back in.
Do you ever convert the type layer to a smart object? Muck around with it?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yep.
Sometimes. I don't usually use smart objects that much. Again, that's just my workflow. I know that smart objects are very smart and they're a great tool to use. I just don't because I just don't. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things. I think it's one of those habits that I've gotten into and that I don't use, and now I just don't use them because I don't use them. And then the day that I'll be like, you know what, learn how to use them and learn how to use them properly, I'll be like, oh man, I should have just been using these all along.
Right, that's all of us. So much to learn.
Cool. So I brought this image back in to Photoshop. And what I'm going to use this as now is I'm actually going to make a selection that's going to allow me to do a kind of a grunge effect on my type. And the reason why I've used this image is it's going to give me a random selection. So I'm going to go to my Magic Wand tool. I'm going to decrease the tolerance back down to like 10. I don't want it to select the whole image. And then I'm going to click one point on the image, and you can't quite see that because it's really tiny. Where's it gone? There we go. And now I'm going to right click so you can see that is just there. And it's just selected, right. Very, very small kind of thing. So all I need to do now is click similar, and it's going to grow that exponentially. So you can see now it's gone in and selected lots of little kind of random bits and pieces of this. Yeah. So now I've got this selection live. So I don't actually have to do anything to the image that I used for that selection. So one of the nice things about selections is you can bring in an image just so that you can use the image as a selection base. And then I can hide this, click on my layer where the type exists, and go and apply a layer mask. So it's used that selection to apply a layer mask to my selected type.
Very good.
Right? And that is now giving me this kind of grunge effect. So it's probably selected too much, like it's taking out too much from my image. I probably want a little bit less. And so again, this is where like the science of which image you use, what selection you've created in here, and how's it actually worked, the amount of tolerance that you've given it. So maybe if I decrease the tolerance to 2, it might give me a little bit less stuff. So similar, see what happens here. Yeah, that's probably a little bit better, right? I've got less of my image selected, and I go back into my type here, make a layer mask, and then I've got that. So that looks bad because it's a lot of it has disappeared, more of it's disappeared. But what I only need to do now is on my layer mask, I just need to say everything that you've made black, I need you to make white, and vice versa. So all I need to do is hit Command I on my layer mask, and it's going to flip that. So it just inverts the entire selection.
Cool.
You can also see just quickly that it has, because of where my image was when I made the selection, it's created the wrong thing. So I just need to unlock that, and then I can move my layer mask over the top of my image.
Nice.
All right. If I don't unlock them and hit Command T, it's going to move my type and my mask at the same time, which usually is what I'd want. But in this case, I want to reset my mask over the top of my image. So there we go. And then lock them. And I've got a little bit of texture on my type here. And again, that's something that you can do in Photoshop, but in Illustrator, but it's just a little bit harder to create this kind of thing. And then I can just keep applying this mask to a whole bunch of different things. So I can take that mask, and with Option held down, I can take it and drag it and apply it to my black here. And that's created the same layer mask that I just used on that is now applying to all of these different layers that I can kind of use in here. And it just really gives it that kind of grunge, easy to go overboard with. But
yeah, that was going to be my question. How do you must have to like walk away or look away for a little bit and then come back and be like, am I putting like too much? Like, is there too much texture going on? Like, is it too busy? Because obviously the texture adds so much. Like as soon as you start adding it in, especially to type, I find that if you're using a standard font, even with the change perspective, it can look a little bit like not very exciting. But as soon as you add that texture in, it makes things a little bit exciting. But you must have to find the balance.
Yeah, 100%. The texture should just serve the purpose of the image, and not be this kind of this gimmicky thing. It's like that thing that they say about special effects. Good special effects are invisible. If you can see the special effects, then the special effect artist has not done their job well, because it's noticeable. And so you obviously want it to be seen, because that's the whole point. But if it becomes this thing of like it's all over the image, it should just be one of those things like, yes, this feels right, and it blends in with the rest of the image, and it contributes to the whole thing. So yeah, it is easy to go overboard with all these different effects and things that are available to you in digital mediums like Photoshop. But yeah.
There's a good question. Can we give perspective to the texture also? Like, would you change? Can you change it now, or would you change it before?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can you can do it now as well. So I've unlinked those two things. So now all I need to do is select and Control T on my texture and do the same thing. So hold down Command, and then drag that. You probably won't notice that texture too much, because that's the nature of that specific texture. But you can absolutely, if you're sort of concerned about, I need the texture to appear like it's getting smaller and bigger, then you can totally do that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you might have something that's like a grain, or wood is a bad example. You probably wouldn't use it too often, but maybe you did. Maybe you wanted a wood texture behind, and then you want to change the perspective. So it's good to know that you can do that.
Yeah, and this is why I have this folder full of different textures, because all of these different things will give me a slightly different look and feel. Like this one's super grainy and very uniform. The one that I used before is a little bit more kind of all over the place. Again, like all these different kind of textures that you can use, like paper, even like that one's really, really subtle, but will give it still a kind of a nice look. So yeah, so again, it's that science of trying to find the right image to get a good texture and then doing the right selection on it is always a little bit tricky. But again, if you have this at a super high res, I can now take this layer mask and apply it to a different image if I want, right? So if I've got like my geisha and I wanted to give her some texture as well, all I need to do is take this layer, Command C for copy, and then Command V, and then I can apply, I can just get rid of this guy. I can just drag that selection on top of my geisha, and it's looking a little bit horrible now because I've got white behind it, but there we go. I've just got like, so you can, like once you've got a texture that you think works well and that you're happy to use, you can just reuse that in as many places as you want. And it's going to really give you that, that look. So you don't necessarily have to redo it every single time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, that's great. Jan was saying in chat, Photoshop is like salt, restraint is key, it adds flavor. I just thought I'd share that one with you as well, because we love the food analogies.
We do love the food analogies, and that is a great one, and it's definitely very accurate. Like you should, like I said, like it's the 60-30-10. If I bring this blue in too much, it's just going to ruin the whole image and it's not going to have that same vibe. It's just there for a pickup, you know, just there to like bring a little bit of something to the image. It's not there to be a flavor of the dish. It's not the hero. It's just a little kind of thing. It's like a bit of seasoning on top, and so don't overdo it for sure.
Just a little salt bay on the top. Tiny little.
Yeah.
I like it. Well, this has been great. So this has been second in our series. We're back for another. Do you want to give us a quick sneak peek at what's happening in 3? We've got about a minute before we'll.
Yeah. So next week we will.
Tell us if you don't have it ready. That's all good. Up to you.
I don't have it ready, but we will look at something a little bit different in Photoshop. So we're not going to be painting necessarily or image creating. We're going to use stuff that we've already done and compose it together to create something a little bit like this.
Awesome. Super cool.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be actually, so that's going to be same time next week, 8:30 here in Sydney, and whatever time it was 2 hours ago in your current time zone. I'm just going to bring up our schedule as well for this week. So here we are, Wednesday 8:30. We're with Jeremy Lord. Tomorrow, if you are able to join us, illustration with Martina Martian. So that she's making her Adobe Live debut for this working from home version. And then on Friday, also Joy Lee. So another new face, fantastic Joy Lee, also from Sydney, focusing on branding and design. We've got some exciting stuff prepared. And then on Friday, again, we're doing a double. We've got Impossible Isometric Illustration with Bill Hope. So all of those interested in illustration, maybe a little bit of animation, maybe even a little bit of sound. It's really exciting. Ooh. He's been mucking around with his new microphone and tools and new toys that he has. So he's got some exciting stuff planned as well. But thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for waking up with us today and teaching us this part 2 in getting started with illustration.
Yeah, thank you guys. It was always super fun, and I really always enjoy all the questions and the comments. Sometimes it gets me a little bit sidetracked, but I do love a good little sidetrack for sure. Yeah. Nice little tangent every now and then.
Exactly. And thanks, chat. It's been awesome. Some fantastic questions in there. Thanks for spending time with us. Hope to see you tomorrow, and also hope to see you next week for part 3 with this illustration. See you later.
Cool. Thanks, guys. See ya.
Bye.